Bleu Night, I believe. I think they're darker blue. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be their darkest blue, but it's darker than Provence. It's darker than something else. Anyways, yeah, I probably have had experience or exposure to Herbin inks for most of my life. I was constantly given the little tins of cartridges. I have tried every single one of them, even Bouquet d'Antan, which is so not my color, but anyways, generally my issue with this brand, from my experience in the past, is that they are undersaturated, that they are generally pretty dry writing, and that they are utterly decimated by water. Since starting to do all these tests and sort of getting to revisit many of them, I've been surprised by a few of them. This one being one example. It actually has some mild water resistance, and the flow is just slightly wet. I would say it's maybe a 5.5 or a 6, which is right where I like my inks. It is a bit undersaturated, however. But yeah, let's take a look. The two pens I used, this was one of them. It's a JinHao X450. Most of my X450s are pretty broad and pretty wet, which is how I like my pens. So that's what that one's like. And also this Ohto Tasche. It's one of those like pocket pens. And it's actually one of the finer nibs I own. In fact, now that my Waterman is out of commission, this might be the finest nib I own. The flow is very moderate, though. It's not wet, it's not dry. So now let's check out the chromatography, which, you know, just from glancing at it, you can tell it probably has a bit of water resistance to it. So you can definitely see where the initial drop was put. There's a very clear gray dot. There's a mild blue halo around it. Gray goes up a bit into that purplish color, and then a bright blue up at the top. That is not my camera messing with the color of blue. It really is that bright, vibrant shade of blue. Here I let it dry, which is not how you're supposed to do it. But you can see the gray got much darker. There's less of it being pushed up. You get more of that purpley blue and then the bright blue up at the top. Now, there's something about this color of blue that I couldn't find anything quite exactly like it. So here's Bleu Nuit. Here's the ink we're using today. Here's Monteverde Blue, which is lighter. It is not as dark, but like if I could condense this just a little bit, it would be so very close. And Noodler's Polar Blue, which obviously is not exactly like it, but again, I couldn't find anything quite like it. So, yeah. Now, I thought I'd see what it could stand up to, because I could see that it had some mild resistance to water. But what's funny is here it didn't really resist the water. But yeah, 1/3 bleach solution turned it yellow, but it's mostly gone. The ammonia pen flush broke it up, but oddly, it looks like the water kind of broke it up more. The hydrogen peroxide did sort of spread it around a bit. It turned it more gray, and the denatured alcohol did absolutely nothing. But yeah, let's check out the paper test. Top down in density, Clairefontaine 90 grams per square meter. I'm going to try and hold this still, but I am so caffeinated. Yeah, see, it's a nice, it's like just a hair on the other side of dark for a medium blue. It's just barely on the dark side. The dark side. Anyways, the Ohto Tasche took 11 seconds to dry, and the broad and wet JinHao only took 14, which is interesting when you compare the difference in line width. That's pretty close dry times. The problem is, so I inked up these pens, I think the day before my surgery, and I was going to like, you know, get my mind off of my surgery, doing ink tests, but then I forgot, and then I didn't finish the tests until almost a week later. But I was kind of fiddling with them, you know, every couple of days, you know, just like take them out, write and play with them or whatever. But they were in the pen for a week, and we have some problems. See that? Now, I know that this is the edge, but it's not just the edge. We get some weird areas of feathering. And there's a kind of woolliness here. I don't really know what's going on. But yeah, again, like I said at the beginning, I find that a lot of times these inks are undersaturated. There's the ink components to water ratio in the ink is just a bit too much heavily favored for water. I mean, here, even in the darkest areas of that wet JinHao, you can still see even the thin lines of the Seize paper. I just wish there was a little more ink in this ink. But yeah, we have these weird areas of feathering, and there's some areas of like near bleed, but still, it's could be a lot worse. But look at this. You can definitely see that. You can definitely read that. It didn't feather, didn't explode, did dye the page a bit, and of course the broad is darker because it put more down, which means more remains, but that was way more than I was expecting. Next up is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter, where again you do get some shading, but it still manages to look undersaturated, because I mean even here in the darkest areas you can still see all the lines of the quadrilateral paper. Now the Ohto Tasche took 10 seconds to dry, but the broad and wet JinHao took 12. That is very close dry times for such vast difference in line width. And again, we have these weird areas of freak feathering. If my camera will ever focus. And it's, I mean, here it's not terrible, but it does crop up in a few places. It is fairly well behaved in that there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. And it did resist water a heck of a lot more than I was anticipating before I started testing it out. I mean, it's not as dark. Actually, it kind of is when you look at it. Anyways, it did dye the page a bit, but if you had to recover that, you absolutely could. That is recoverable. Next up is Tomoe River paper, which does tend to draw out dry times, but even still here, the dry times, I mean, they're within 3 seconds of each other. And look at the difference in width of writing. I mean, that's pretty impressive. You definitely get shading. You get this crazy halo effect. You see here where it starts to like turn gray in the wettest parts. I mean, that's kind of cool. That was me. I put my, was like, as I was writing and I was scooting up the page, I put my finger there when it wasn't quite dry yet, but yeah. Yeah, I say that there is some echo, but I mean, this is like just on the dark side of medium blue, and this is a broad nib, and it is fairly wet, and this is extremely thin paper, so I feel like that's something that should have been anticipated. So, yeah, follows logic, you know. Now, this paper loves to let ink slide away when you add more water, and it kind of did, but honestly, considering what I've seen this paper let wash away, the fact that this much remained for a Herbin ink, when I went into this test, I was not expecting this. That's pretty dark, pretty there. It didn't feather explode. It survived. If you had to recover that, you absolutely could. Now for the next 3 tests, I only used the Ohto Tasche, except to write the name. Now, here's the world's worst 20-pound copier paper. And I hope I can show you the difference in line width here. See how it looks on the Rhodia versus the 20-pound copier paper? See how much broader it got? I mean, it almost starts to look like the broad JinHao. There was significant spread. You lose all shading. It only takes 1 second to dry. You do get feathering if we look at theirs. See that? JinHao. It's woolly. It's not great in that regard. And considering this is now probably the finest nib that I own, and that is quite moderate, and this isn't an obscenely wet ink, the fact that we get all of this, and bear in mind there's a very bright light coming this direction, so the fact that we can see that is not encouraging. But what's interesting is, so this was written with the broad, and this was written with the Ohto Tasche. It's almost the same, which is kind of amusing. Now the water test, look at that, it is as dark as all of the other writing. It's just slightly more purple, and the blue washed away. It's very clear, very there. It's sort of like if you add more water and let more of the blue wash off, that would be very easy to read. Absolutely recoverable. Next up is Mead Notebook Paper, where it took 2 seconds to dry. And here, there's almost no bleed, but there is some echo, there is some show through, but bear in mind this paper is thinner than the 20-pound copier paper. Now, there is a woolliness, and the thing is, this ink, when it's not put down heavily, it can look undersaturated, it can look watery. And here it kind of achieves that again. It starts to look a bit thin. But yeah, there is some spread, but as you can see, it's nowhere near as bad as the 20-pound copier paper. There is an intense woolliness that I guess you could even call feathering. And again, this paper hates water. A lot of times when we add water, like, things just start to explode off of the writing. But here, no, the purple at the center is very clear, very there. It is every bit as dark as the regular writing, and you can kind of see the blue starting to spread off, which is amusing. Now, lastly is Moleskine notebook paper, where we start having some pretty intense problems. Now, you do retain some shading, I mean, as you can see in this scrubby, but it took 8 seconds to dry. I mean, like, hang on, let me check. Yeah, I mean, it barely took that long on the fancy paper. I mean, and the thing is, you can tell that it got absorbed because look at that really wet wool texture. I mean, it looks, bleh. Looks like somebody dunked a, you know, ball of yarn into like a bucket of water. But also, I mean, this is an extremely fine nib. It is so moderate, and yet, look at this. Okay, that's broad, but like you see all these feathers? And they're noticeable, and they're large, and they are absolutely everywhere. They are distracting. That does not look good. And yet somehow, the writing still manages to look kind of watery. Not encouraging. And then, this is sort of the first time we've seen this, that the central like color starts to feather and explode. Usually that stays still and the blue washes off. No, here that's making a mess. And again, this is probably the finest and most moderate nib I own, and there's a bright light coming in this direction, and yet still we can see all this near bleed through. I hate Moleskine. Anyways, there you go for your consideration. Herbin's Bleu Nuit. Oh god, I'm never going to get to say that correctly, but yeah, it's sort of their darker of the two blues, of the like two main blues. From their standard series, not counting 1670 Blue Ocean. I went into this because this, you know, I mean, blue is, you know, one of those standard inks that you get, I mean, when you're not being given like crazy things like orange or whatever. So this was one of the inks that was given to me a lot. And so I went into this expecting what I've remembered from the last like 15 years of my life or more. I was surprised. I didn't know that it had that much water resistance. I didn't realize that if you put it in a broad nib, it will dry comparatively quickly to a finer nib. It is not perfectly well behaved, but I mean, the weird feathering, maybe that had something to do with it being in a pen for a week. But I mean, it wasn't like it was just sitting there. I mean, like every day it would get used a little bit, but yeah, it is a little undersaturated. And, but it was not dry like I remembered most J. Herbin inks to be, and it was not, you know, it was not made completely watered. Oh god, I'm gonna have to edit that out. Anyways, I was pleasantly surprised. It's not perfect, but it was better than I expected. Yeah, so for your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.